Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we have Louise Wise of Relatus on to discuss stamp duty reliefs, and stamp duty more widely. Quite timely, we are coming off the back of the stamp duty, I was going to say holiday, but to no conveyancer was the end of March a holiday. But there are still things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to stamp duty that hopefully you can enlighten us today. Louise, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're amongst another lawyer. Your background is in family law, isn't it, Louise? And you've moved into effectively taxation. But tell us a bit about yourself and your role at Relatus, and indeed tell us about Relatus as well.
So as you said, I started my life as a family law solicitor, my work life. One of those kinds of people that I love the law, I love reading legislation and case law. So yes, it's a bit of a strange leap, I suppose, from family law to taxation. But for me, it still has all the sort of key elements that I enjoy. So yeah, lots of nerdy legislation reading is what I love. So yeah, I came to Relatus 11 years ago now. When I first joined Relatus, we didn't really deal with taxation and stamp duty. It was more business rates for sort of commercial premises, helping business owners to claim business rate reliefs and make sure they're paying the correct amount. And it's from there that we sort of recognised that taxation is another area where purchasers don't realise that the standard rates of stamp duty are not always what you have to pay. So there are reliefs out there, there are different rates of stamp duty, and we recognised it as an area where perhaps we could add value. So it's then that I undertook the ATT examination and sort of got to grips with tax and stamp duty in general. And that's where Relatus then started to sort of deal specifically in stamp duty land tax, and we now sort of specialise in that area.
And I remember you saying to me that you started out predominantly focusing on consumers, actually, didn't you? And supporting them. But more recently, you've started to look at how you can support the legal sector as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the very beginning, it was reaching out to people that had just purchased properties that we recognised may well have overpaid their stamp duty, and dealing with them on a one-to-one basis to amend their stamp duty returns, claim back refunds for them. But yeah, we really, what we would like to do, rather than coming along as, I suppose, what you'd term a reclaims company, we'd rather be there at the beginning of the transaction, working with the conveyancers to make sure that all the considerations have been made to sort of assess whether the property is one that would qualify for a certain rate of stamp duty or a certain relief, whether the purchaser has certain characteristics that need to be taken into account. So we'd really like to move more towards working with conveyancers rather than sort of coming in afterwards and trying to resolve, what's already happened.
Well, there's nothing quite like being told that you're wrong, is there?
No, exactly. No. And we don't like to tell people that they're wrong. So yeah, we'd much rather be there at the beginning saying, let's look at this together. Let's work out what stamp duty should be paid, and let's make sure there are no errors or mistakes, and make sure that the purchaser is getting the best service really from the conveyancer as well as us, because a client is going to be very happy if you're telling them that they don't have to pay that amount of stamp duty they first thought they did.
I think it's fair to say it's a sector that's got a bit of a mixed reputation. Louise, the SRA took the step of issuing a warning note not too long ago about SDLT specifically, and companies that were going around and claiming that they could find gaps in the submissions. Certainly, HMRC take a very dim view of it, and there have been a number of quite high profile cases that have hit the courts, haven't there? I guess in that kind of context, my question to you is, where's the line? Where's that line between caution and pushing the envelope and making sure that you don't go too far and start to, ultimately annoy and upset a rather sizable organisation in HMRC?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, you're right. There are firms out there, there are tax advisors out there that will take the legislation much, much further than it ever should have been taken. And you're right, HMRC have taken a very dim view of that, and they are actively pursuing those tax agents that they believe are sort of making almost fraudulent claims. For Relatus, we always follow the legislation. That being said, the legislation isn't clear, so there's always scope for interpretation. And what we have to bear in mind is that HMRC will obviously have their interpretation of the legislation, and when they think certain reliefs and certain sort of stamp duty treatments are applicable, we will look at the purpose of the legislation. We will look at recent tax tribunal decisions, because they give us an independent view of what a tribunal judge believes is the right application of the legislation to a particular scenario. So we'll always bear that in mind when we're advising in relation to a particular relief or a particular stamp duty treatment. But that being said, we do recognise that there are times when HMRC get it wrong, and we are willing to, I suppose, not push it as such, but we are willing to challenge HMRC. But always that challenge is always backed in our minds by the legislation itself or the purpose of the legislation. Sometimes even HMRC's own guidance, because they will contradict themselves, and we can refer them back to a point in their stamp duty manual that makes our point rather than theirs. So it's knowing the legislation inside and out, which I do. It's keeping up to date with tribunal decisions, which again I do, and that's something that I enjoy doing. And it's just making sure that you don't go beyond that. You don't start you don't start pushing it too far. You don't start encouraging people to claim reliefs when there's absolutely no way that a tribunal or HMRC would ever agree that it was appropriate. And it's something that we do. We do challenge HMRC. We've taken cases to the tax tribunal. We've recently just won another case against HMRC, actually, in relation to multiple dwelling relief. So there are times when you can see that you're following the guidance, but HMRC are trying to narrowly interpret it. So it's just, as I say, sort of bearing in mind the legislation always and the case law.
Well, you mentioned multiple dwellings relief, which I think went under the radar in terms of it being abolished, didn't it? So 1st of June 2024, multiple dwellings relief was no longer a thing. Obviously, quite a popular loophole in inverted commas, perhaps. What reliefs are available? And I guess where I'm going here is, conveyancers sits down or receives a file, opens up the file. What kind of property are we looking at where the conveyance might well be thinking to themselves, do you know what, maybe this isn't a standard 2 up, 2 down, and I can go use the gov.uk calculator, but actually, there are other reliefs here that I could consider?
Yeah, so it's not just the property that a conveyancer needs to consider. So there are those obvious reliefs. So multiple dwelling relief, that was a very obvious relief. Have you purchased a property that's more than one dwelling? So that was pretty obvious when you were looking at the property details. The other sort of main areas that we deal with, and they're not always reliefs. So people talk about stamp duty reliefs quite a lot, but sometimes it's the rate of stamp duty that can be different because of a particular property. So a common area that we're dealing with at the moment is mixed use property. So that's when you perhaps purchase a rural property that has the residential house and gardens, but perhaps has some land that's perhaps not attached to the garden itself, perhaps separated by a road, or public footpaths. That property potentially should be treated as a mixed use property because it has both residential and non-residential elements to it. And that means that the non-residential rate stamp duty should apply. And that's quite a difficult concept for people to understand sometimes, because they'll think, well, no, I'm buying a house with a garden and yes, it's got a bit of land, but that doesn't mean it's non-residential. And I think people also, when they think about non-residential, they think about commercial. And that is another time when conveyancers, should be thinking about the rates of stamp duty. Have they got a flat with a shop below it? That again will be perhaps the more obvious consideration. And again, the non-residential rate of stamp duty should apply there. There are also, reliefs that might not be based on the property itself, but on the purchaser. You could have a developer company that purchases properties from probate. So provided that company meets the criteria, there will be relief on that stamp duty transaction, meaning that no stamp duty is payable at all. So there are some very specific reliefs that relate to the property itself, but there are also those specific reliefs that relate to the purchaser. So a conveyancer, they have a lot of things to consider, not only the property that's being purchased, but who's purchasing it, why are they purchasing it, what are their intentions with that property, because sometimes you can claim a relief with for example, the probate relief I just mentioned. That relief can be claimed, but if certain conditions aren't met for a 3-year period, that will trigger a clawback of that relief by HMRC, meaning that then the stamp duty is payable. So that's another thing to sort of consider at the outset, because perhaps there needs to be advice there to the purchaser about what they do with that property going forward. You also need to consider the circumstances of the purchasers themselves. So with individuals purchasing residential properties, it could be that you purchase a property with a garden, there's nothing interesting about it, it's a straightforward stamp duty transaction, but the purchaser themselves have certain characteristics that mean that a different rate is applicable. So perhaps one that conveyancers are most familiar with will be the higher rate of stamp duty, because that purchaser has already got another property and they're purchasing this one not as a replacement but as a second home, for example. But sometimes even with the higher rate, you may think it applies because that purchaser has another property in the background, but there are situations where it won't be applicable because either they have another property but they are replacing a main residence, or perhaps they've inherited a property. So there are lots of considerations, and Relatus can help with that. We can provide a sort of a pro forma questionnaire, I suppose, that raises all of the questions, and some of them perhaps a conveyancer wouldn't have thought to ask because they wouldn't necessarily be thinking about all the specific reliefs, rates, what's going to apply to this purchaser, what's going to apply to this property. But we know all of that, so we know what questions to ask, and if we can help you with that, it means that everything is being considered at the outset, and that's correct rate of stamp duty is going to apply.
You've recently written an article for today's Conveyancer, actually, which I'm biased, I thought was a really good read, but a really interesting read around new build, because in the article you explain that there is actually a way that if a developer is offering incentives on the property, that can be offset against the property value, and therefore stamp duty could be reduced.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, for some conveyancers, they will deal primarily in new build transactions. And you're right, there are certain incentives that developers will offer. And I think whenever we drive through a new build housing estate now, you can see all the banners and the flags that are advertising, we'll pay your stamp duty, we'll pay towards your mortgage, we'll pay your moving costs. Some of those incentives, take the stamp duty one, for example, some people will think, well, they're paying my stamp duty, so I don't have to worry about that. But actually what they're doing is they're reducing your purchase price by the amount that your stamp duty would be. And that means that the consideration for the stamp duty calculation should be the purchase price less that contribution that they're making to the stamp duty. And for purchasers, I mean, the difference to them in terms of stamp duty, it could be anywhere from sort of £500 to £1,000. So it's not a huge amount, but when you're purchasing a property, everything helps. And again, it's just making sure that it is the correct amount of stamp duty that's being paid. And just linking it back to what I said earlier, that's why it's not only the property that you have to think about. I mean, yes, in this instance, it's a new build property that's being purchased, but you've also got to think about what is the consideration that's actually being paid here? What should the stamp duty be charged on? And so it's considering what incentives, and there are certain incentives that won't fall within that bracket. So if you're receiving flooring in your kitchen, for example, that won't affect the consideration. So there are some that you don't need to worry about, but there are those financial incentives out there that should reduce the consideration that the stamp duty is based on. Obviously, from a developer's point of view, they like that purchase price to be the higher amount because that looks good for them. And when you're looking at a property, you can see what they've sold for previously. But it's just something else that conveyancers need to be thinking about. And again, it's something that Relatus can help with. We can deal with the more complicated properties, reliefs, mixed use, company purchases, but we can also help at that sort of lower level, I suppose you'd call it, where we're looking at the purchase price, the consideration, what incentives, what should that level of stamp duty be. And I think for Relatus, what perhaps also sets us apart from other firms is that we would do that with a human touch. So I, for example, would look at that transaction. We don't have calculators that we would ask you to fill out that gives you a standard response, much like the HMRC calculator that exists that doesn't help anyone at all. There's nowhere in that HMRC calculator that you can put in incentives. It doesn't even give you a tip that that's something you could be thinking about. But with Relatus, it's a human looking at it. We will be considering all the different angles and talking to you about it. And I think, again, I just think that's something that conveyancers would benefit from as well as the clients. It's important to bear in mind as well that although conveyancers are experts in the process of legal aspects of purchasing a property, stamp duty is probably something that they don't want to deal with, but they have to because it's part of that transaction. So they have to tell their clients that it's due, how much is due, and they have to deal with that stamp duty return. But in doing so, they are then liable for that advice, if you can call it that, and for that stamp duty calculation. But that's something that Relatus can help with. So we can take responsibility for giving that professional and accurate stamp duty advice and ultimately for that stamp duty calculation. If something comes up in the future, for example, a compliance check is issued by HMRC, that means that that advice is sort of called into question, then the purchaser would of course be able to come back to Relatus because we provided that advice. And although a conveyancer will always owe a duty of care to their client, and this would include stamp duty calculation and treatment as well, in our view, it would be sufficient to discharge or at least mitigate any liability if they can show that they've acted in accordance with written advice from a suitably sort of qualified professional and that was documented on their file. So although that duty of care is there, I think they can show that they've fulfilled their sort of professional standards by sort of acting on advice from an expert. I think that's a valuable consideration for conveyancers because it might be something that they've not fully considered. Filling out a stamp duty return is part of the job that they have to do, and perhaps in most cases they think it's a standard form filling exercise, but what we're saying is it's not. There are lots of considerations that have to be made before that form is filled out, and what you don't want to be is in a position where the client comes back to you in sort of 8 months' time and says, I've got a problem here, what are we going to do about it?
You kind of preempted my next question, which was about liability. But one of the things I was thinking about is you're talking there is who's driving this decision to take this forward? Is it the conveyancer that's kind of doing it on behalf of the client? Is it the conveyancer going to the client and saying, look, we think we might have a bit of an angle here? But even then, is the conveyancer under some obligation to say, but there's a bit of a risk because it's stamp duty, it could go either way depending on which way the wind's blowing.
Yeah, so what we would like is that for conveyancers, tax advice becomes one of those services that they outsource at the beginning of a transaction, much like searches, something where they need professional, unqualified advisors to provide a report, or in this case, a written advice that's supported by legislation and case law, detailing how a particular aspect of the transaction should be dealt with. It's true that there's always an element of risk with stamp duty because it's an interpretation of legislation which doesn't always have clear definitions within it. So there's no set list of criteria which guarantees no risk. It's not that simple. If a conveyancer has advised their client in relation to stamp duty without seeking any external advice, they would have the obligation to provide correct advice and to warn the client of any risks. They would also be liable in negligence should that advice be incorrect. If a conveyancer has referred a client to us, we would have the responsibility for providing that accurate and professional advice. And as part of our advice, we always make the client aware of any risks, should HMRC change their view, for example. And of course, we have the appropriate professional indemnity insurance in place for the advice that we provide. Even when we have given the advice, as I said earlier, a conveyancer will owe that duty of care to their clients. And in my view, they would still need to make it clear that following any advice in relation to stamp duty has a level of risk attached to it. But provided that conveyancer is satisfied that we are suitably qualified to provide that advice, and that they have kept a record of that advice, as well as any warnings they've given to the client on their file, I would hope that that would be sufficient to demonstrate that they have met their sort of required professional standards in terms of the duty of care that they do owe to that client. Another risk for a conveyancer in not seeking sort of professional external advice is that HMRC are able to issue a compliance check in relation to a stamp duty return in the same way that they do for amendments of returns. So just because you've told HMRC that this is the stamp duty that's due, that doesn't necessarily mean that HMRC will agree with you. They can come back and ask additional questions. And again, that's a service that Relatus covers. So we are experienced in dealing with compliance checks, and we will pursue appeals to the tax tribunal. A compliance check is not something I would ever expect a conveyancer to want to be involved in or to be comfortable being involved in, because it's a very involved, very lengthy process, and it will probably come at least 8 months down the line. So for a conveyancer at that point, their job is usually done, obviously subject to any sort of land registry delays, but sort of 8 months down the line, I would hope that the file is closed and has gone off to storage. So the last thing they want is HMRC sort of rearing their ugly heads and saying that they'd like to look into the stamp duty return that you've made on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. But for us as tax advisors, that's part of the service we offer, and it's an area that we are experienced and qualified to act in.
And of course, 8 months down the line, using your example, cases forgotten about, an HMRC could come knocking, but not just for an overpayment, but also for an underpayment as well.
Yeah, and from HMRC's point of view, I suppose it's more likely to be those underpayments that they're going to be pursuing. We've all heard about the tax gap and obviously trying to close that in pursuing people that have underpaid their taxes, and stamp duty is one of those. So HMRC will be looking for any instances where someone hasn't paid the right amount of stamp duty, and it's a worrying time for a purchaser, definitely, because they're looking at not only having to pay that additional amount of tax that HMRC should have been paid at the outset, but they're also then going to be potentially liable to interest. And the interest charged by HMRC at the moment is ridiculously high. It's 8.25%. So it is a really high amount of interest, and depending on the amount of tax they say is underpaid, that can be a huge consideration. You also potentially have the risk of penalties as well. If HMRC decide that you've underpaid tax and that was because it was a careless or a deliberate error, you could then be looking at penalties that range from 30% of the underpaid tax up to 100%. So for a purchaser, that is the last thing they want to be hearing from HMRC. And for a conveyancer, if you're the one that dealt with that stamp duty return, and you may have acted on your client's instructions, because we've all had clients that come to you and say, I know what tax I should be paying, I've read an article about it, I've read a case, this is definitely me, and I'm not paying any more than that. But those clients don't always get it right. And I think one of the most common ones I see is in relation to company purchases of properties. So for a company that's purchasing a residential property that's worth over £500,000, there's an automatic 17% rate of stamp duty that should be applied. But there are conditions that, if they're met, that rate isn't applicable, and they would then pay just the higher rate of 5%. But I have a lot of people that will say, oh, that definitely doesn't apply to me. And if a conveyancer sort of acts on their client's instructions and sort of follows what they're saying is the correct amount of tax, the difference between a 17% flat rate and a 5% additional rate on the normal stamp duty bands is a huge difference. So those interest, the penalties on that amount, and the underpaid tax itself is going to be a huge consideration, which for a conveyancer is, again, it's that liability. Are they the ones that were negligent? Because yes, they may have followed their client's instructions, but did they have the correct experience, the correct knowledge to enable them to advise them fully? Should they have been advising that, no, that's not the correct rate, you should be paying this higher rate from the outset? Obviously, the client's not going to want to hear that, but I'm sure they'd rather hear that then than 8 months down the line, when not only do they have to pay that additional amount, but also 8 months worth of interest and those penalties as well. So yeah, as I say, it's important that at the beginning we're assessing the correct rate, not just what can we save the client, what's the best saving we can get them, but are we sure that they're paying the correct amount of tax from the outset? Are we sure that if a compliance check is raised by HMRC, we as the conveyancer have done everything we can to ensure that that client has received the correct tax advice and that that stamp duty return has been completed correctly? And hopefully that compliance check then would quickly be dealt with and there would be no repercussions. But as I say, for a conveyancer, that's a huge consideration for them.
I think it's a great comparison that you make between, for example, searches, but more importantly, just outsourcing to that expert view, that expert opinion. And increasingly, we talk about conveyancing being complicated, complex, more spinning plates than ever before. And, quite frankly, conveyancers need help. And if this is one way in which they might be able to get a little bit of help, then perhaps it's worth looking into. But great to have had you on the podcast and sharing your expertise and your insight, Louise. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Louise. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.